Today, I will tell you a terrifying story narrated by Pavitra Ghosh. The name of the story is After 10 at Night. If you have any terrifying or life-changing incident from your life, feel free to share it with us. We will feature your story in our upcoming video, so others can learn from it as well. The greatest teacher in our lives is our past. Stories from history repeatedly hint at how our decisions lead us toward certain outcomes. But humans, as students, are not very diligent. He repeatedly tries to violate the rules of history. However, not every mistake humans make is deliberate. Often, they unknowingly get entangled in the course of history. Today, you will hear a story of such a course. I will tell you the tale of a mummy. However, this is not about the standard desert of Egypt, but about the story of the Victoria King's Museum. Stay tuned for After 10 at Night. I can't understand how to express everything. It's been almost 2 weeks since I last went outside due to fear. Just a few days ago, the events that have unfolded in my life have been so overwhelming that if I try to process them, my entire life will be allured. I was studying for my graduation in a certain city. I rented a small space in an old mansion at the lower level. Though the house was old, it was quite peaceful and far away from the chores of the city. For a student like me, it was a perfect place to focus on my studies. I had heard that many years ago, this might have been the residence of a king. The house was old, yet it had a certain grace and tranquility about it, despite the hustle and bustle of the city. There was an undeniable peacefulness in that environment. Where I lived, there was a possibility that an ancient royal court still lingered. The stories I had heard created a vivid, almost haunting image in my mind. The current owner had bought the house from a descendant of that very king's family. The landlord was a very kind person. He lived on the upper floor and allowed me to stay on the lower floor, facing the front. During my time in that house, I was often filled with a deep sense of fear, but the landlord's calmness and good nature helped me a lot. In front of this house, there was a garden. It had white flowers of various colors and grass. There was a patch of blue flowers among the grass. From there, the scent of jasmine flowers would drift through the air. The fragrance from the garden carried a sense of ancient, sweet nostalgia, as if it held both hope and forgotten memories. The smoothing fragrance would wash away all the exhausting from my body. Seeing everything around me, I thought my university days would pass peacefully. But anyway, the room he gave me to stay in was quite simple. Inside, there was a bed, a desk, a chair, and walls marked with several stains. Still, I had no trouble arranging my books and other belongings. A branch of the main road sloped down right in front of my room. However, what I loved the most was the large, semicircular thick glass window. The window was located right next to my door, with heavy wooden shutters that seemed to groan under their own weight. But I always kept them open. In the mornings, as the soft timid sunlight slowly entered the east-facing room. I often felt like a character in some enchanting fantasy world. But now, whenever I think of that window, a wave of sadness washes over me. A month passed by in the blink of an eye. I realized that alongside my studies, I would have to take up a part-time job. My father, a private school teacher, earned very little. The money he sent me was barely enough to get by. Something had to be done. After a lot of searching, I finally managed to find a job. I started working as an accountant for Ranaouaz, an old moneylender who ran a small office in a nearby market. The man was incredibly short-tempered and exceptionally miserly. I had to be there every day at 5 p.m. and work for almost 5 hours. The pay was only 1,000 taka per month, but at that time, 1,000 taka felt like a lakh to me. With no other options, I started the job. The office was in Mumbai, but everything was handled here. The landlord, or rather the boss, looked like a prince. He was about 6 feet tall with a perfectly straight posture. The place where I worked was his office, Ranaouaz's office. There was some kind of business going on, though I couldn't say exactly what it was. However, I was sure about one thing: it wasn't a legitimate business. There was something shadowy about it, something dishonest. I also noticed another thing. He seemed to have connections with the underworld. That's why he always seemed to know everything. The day of my interview at his house, I was a little late. The reason was that I had to go to contribute money for one of my classmates' father, who was ill. When I finally arrived at his house, I was already a little past 4 p.m., although my scheduled time had been around 3 p.m. At that time, no one was in the house. The other people who had come for interviews had probably already left after theirs. Even then, I nervously rang the doorbell. A few moments later, the landlord opened the door with an annoyed expression on his face. I thought he would dismiss me, but when he heard I had come for the interview, he asked me to come inside. He made me sit in a small room with a small library. I apologized at first for being late. I was about to explain why I was delayed, but he didn't let me speak. Instead, he started explaining everything to me. I quickly realized that no one else had come for the interview. I had opened. He would assign me some task, and he did, but in a manner that made me stay quiet and listen intently. When he finished speaking, he suddenly laughed and said in a mocking tone, "So, you were collecting money for your friend's father? Well, that's good. People like you. Generous are what I have been looking for. Just make sure you handle your task on time and you will be fine." Listening to his words, I was completely taken aback. How did he know about me collecting money for my friend's father? That was something only the people from our college would have known. It was possible that someone from my class had spoken to him during their interview, but I was sure that everyone from our class was present that day. Now, how could anyone have left and given him such information? It felt unreal. But still, I tried to console myself with the thought. However, before I left the room, Ranaouaz said, "Tell everyone hello from me." At the moment, I was certain this man was undeniably mysterious. I had never once told him where I stayed, nor was it mentioned in my CV. In fact, I had put a friend's address on the CV since there were some postal issues in the area where I live. Letter and parcels never arrive on time. So, how did this man know everything about me? With an unsettling feeling in my heart, I returned home. I even asked my landlord about Ranaouaz once, but he claimed he didn't know anyone by the name. I realized then Ranaouaz was definitely not someone to trust. Yet I couldn't shake off the desire to finish the work. I thought, let me continue for a few more days and see what happens. If I felt like the work was becoming too burdensome, I would rather quit. However, it wasn't just the work itself, but the environment where I was working. Ranaouaz's house felt quite mysterious. There was something strange and secretive about it that made everything more unsettling. The house I was renting was a large mansion, similar to an old place, but it was quite new. It wasn't steeped in history, unlike others of its kind. Probably the owner had built it himself. It was maybe only about 5 years old. The garden surrounding the house was lush and attractive, making the exterior of the house look welcoming. But in comparison to the outside, the interior was far more intriguing and mysterious. For me, even though it served as an office, it felt more like a gathering place for secretive activities. Ranaouaz spent money from his own pocket on various things, bringing in goods and goods from all around the world. It seemed as though he was involved in something far beyond ordinary business dealings. I had heard about wealthy people being involved in collecting unusual items, but today I saw it with my own eyes. The man had transformed his house into a museum of sorts. The day I started working, he took samples of my handprint and blood, which seemed odd at the time. I couldn't help but wonder, if one day he were to harm me and escape with his valuable collection, what would happen to me? In the collection room, there were many items that would have made anyone's eyes widen with shock. There were bizarre artifacts, battle garments, chained weapons, expensive fabrics, and an ancient ceremonial chair, along with many other items. Each one seemed to hold a story, a dark, unsettling story. But the most eye-catching item of all was a mummy. In the middle of the collection room, resting on a long wooden box, was the mummy. It seemed to be preserved with great care. The mummy, with its delicate, wrapping and lifeless gaze, was displayed in the center as if it held the greatest significance. The sight of it left a chilling impression on me, as if the mummy itself was a silent witness to the mysterious surrounding that place. When describing the mummy, if you asked me to explain it, the first thing I would say is that when first the saw mummy, it felt as if there was a strange, rotten smell and in their air, and it lingered. Mr. Ranaouaz said he himself cleans this room every day. That's why the smell isn't really noticeable around here. Otherwise, there are occasional cracking and knocking sounds, but It's not that. As for the mummy itself, it was something you can't describe easily. I couldn't think of it in any other way. So I didn't pay much attention to it. The mummy appeared to be like a regular mummy, with his body wrapped in clothes, but its hands, finger, and head were uncovered. I was stunned because there was no sign of any physical damage of the mummy's body. The top of its head was wrapped with bouncing red flesh. The fingernails of the hands were long and sharp, and the toenails were similarly shaped. But what shocked me the most was the mummy was about 7 feet tall. Although it's true that crops tend to appear longer in a state of decay, I still don't know if the ancient Egyptians were actually this tall. For a moment, I even wondered if this was a real mummy at all or just some fake doll crafted by a clever florist trying to fool people. The old man, however, seemed incredibly proud of the mummy. With a voice full of pride, he asked me once, "Doesn't it seem like this one must have been someone powerful when alive?" Even though I had my doubt about the authenticity of the mummy, I decided not to share them with the old man. What was the point of poking holes in the story? Whether this mummy was real or fake didn't matter much to me. My only concern was doing my job and getting paid for it. So I simply smiled without saying much. Where and how the old man managed to acquire this mummy, I have no idea. But he told me a fascinating story about it. According to him, this mummy was made from the preserved remains of a warrior named John. Back in ancient Egypt, John was said to have been personal bodyguard of an unnamed Egyptian king. The old man didn't know the name of the king, but he claimed that the king had once saved John from certain death when he was a child. Ever since then, John became fairly loyal to the king. His duties not only involved protecting the king but also eliminating his enemies. A devoted servant to the end, John loved his master so much that he wouldn't even let anyone he disliked get near the king. In fact, John was so dedicated that he went a step further. He would track down and kill anyone the king secretly despised, even if the king hadn't said a word about it. In the end, John's obsessive devotion to his master drove him to madness. For some unknown reason, he eventually ended up killing the very king he once vowed to protect. No one ever found out why John murdered the king. When I was looking at the mummy, Mr. Ranaouaz was standing right next to me. For some reason, I had this eerie feeling that if Mr. Ranaouaz stepped out of the room, the mummy would suddenly come to life and stand up. Meanwhile, the smell in their air was unbearable, sticking to my nose like a ghostly presence. One thing that kept surprising me was how there was no one else living nearby such a massive museum-like hall. Given the size of the place, you would think there'd be guard station on protect it. For a house filled with priceless artifacts, you had need at least 8 to 10 people working as security. But that wasn't the case. Aside from me, there wasn't a single full-time worker in this massive mansion. Even the so-called security measures were laudable. Just a fingerprint-activated lock on the main door. Yet, if thieves or robbers ever showed up. There was no backup plan in place. One day, I brought up the topic to Mr. Ranaouaz, pointing toward the mummy. He looked at me with an almost mystical expression and said, "Oh, don't worry. I King body has its own garden at the gate." The way he said that sent a shiver down my spine. From that date onward, I couldn't look at the mummy without feeling a strange, creeping chill. My job was simple. I had to sit in a small, plywood enclosed office in one corner of the hall and work on MS Excel, managing account and records. Mr. Ranaouaz had given me a thick file filled with transaction records from various companies over the last few months. But even as I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly off about this place. My job was to transfer the records to the computer and email them. That was all. The ground floor of the house was completely empty, as were the third and fourth floors. The second floor housed the collection hall, and right next to it was the library. The same library where my interview had taken place. The collection hall itself was 15 feet by 20 feet. I figured every room in the house was probably the same size. It felt like the entire house had been designed with the idea of turning it into a museum. The collection hall was the main attraction, with various artifacts arranged around the room. One corner was designed as my workspace, while another had Mr. Ranaouaz's desk. His desk, however, seemed untouched. He rarely, if ever, used it. In the middle of the hall stood the mummy. It was raised on a platform about 15 feet tall, its empty, gaping eye shocked, staring strange ahead. On my first day, when Mr. Ranaouaz gave me a tour, he mentioned two rules I had to follow. First, I wasn't allowed to tell anyone about the museum. And second, I had to leave the museum by 10 p.m. every night. At the time, I didn't think much of it, but as the days passed, I started to feel uneasy. There was something about the mummy. It unsettled me in a ways I couldn't explain. The question kept nagging at me. Why 10 p.m.? Why not earlier? Honestly, I would have felt better if I left by 9 p.m. This was an isolated, rural area with no guard or security for the collection hall. On top of that, I wasn't allowed to tell anyone about the museum or my work there. And then there was that strict 10 p.m. rule. The whole place had an atmosphere of dread, a haunting sense of secrecy that made my skin crawl. I always had this unrealing sense of fear while working there. In the afternoons, when I had to start my work, the old owner, Mr. Ranaouaz, would usually be at home. Despite the air vibe of the place, I enjoyed being surrounded by all the strange artifacts during the day. Every evening, about half an hour before 10 p.m., Mr. Ranaouaz would come to me and say, "Shut down the computer and fresh up." Then, exactly 10 minutes before 10 p.m., he would escort me out, lock the door, and secure the house for the night. The beginning of my misfortune started about 10 days ago. It was a Monday, the first Monday of the month, which was also the day I was supposed to get my salary. I had planned to buy a book that day, so I thought I would stop by the library after getting paid. But all my plans were crossed by that old man, Mr. Ranaouaz. That evening at exactly 9 p.m., he called me into his office. I went and sat in front of this desk. What happened next was a conversation in Hindi, but I will translate to Bengali. Oh, then sorry, I will translate it into English. I have to go to Mumbai for some business, he said. I am leaving the expense reports on your desk. Review them and complete the work. I assumed he was also leaving my salary there, but when I asked him about it, his mood immediately changed. He got angry and replied, "Salary? When did I say I had pay? You know, I will give it to you when I return from the city. Just focus on your work. Why are you so fixed on money at your age?" I was furious. I wanted to grab that old man, break his arms and legs, and lock him in one of the empty rooms of the house. The thought was so vivid in my mind that it made my head spin. And then, for a few seconds, everything in front of me went completely dark. The light in the room started flickering, dimming, and brightening as if on their own. The next day, I borrowed money from a friend to buy the book I needed, promising to repay once my family sent some cash. I carried on with my work, trusting that Mr. Ranaouaz would pay me when he returned. I thought to myself, surely he wouldn't be so dishonest as to withhold my salary entirely. A few days later, I arrived at Mr. Ranaouaz's house a bit earlier than usual. The place felt eerily empty, more so than I had ever noticed before. On other days, the old man would be around, so I had not paid much attention. But that day, as I walked through the iron gate and into the house, it felt like the whole place was trying to swallow me whole. Something felt off. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was inside the house. It wasn't just a passing thought, it was a heavy, looming presence. The absence of Mr. Ranaouaz had left me in a bad spot. He had gone off, leaving me to deal with whatever this space was hiding. And now, for the first time, I realized just how unsettling this house truly was. In the delaying, I started to say strange shade for fear creeping into everything. It felt as if something ominous was about to happen, as though the air itself carried a warning. Before leaving, Mr. Ranaouaz had given me the key to the collection hall. I unlocked the door and stopped inside, my eyes immediately drawn to the mummy. As always, it was laying in its as usual spot, lifeless and still. Yet I couldn't stand there for long. The only sound in the room was the rhythmic ticking of the large pendulum clock. Aside from that, there was nothing, just a vast, echoing silence. With a growing sense of uneasy, I quickly related to my small workplace and locked the door behind me. I couldn't help but think how much easier it would be if there was at last a peon or someone to bring tea. As I turned on the computer, a ridiculous thought crossed my mind. The mummy is supposed to guard the place, right? Could it also handle the arrangement? I chuckled to myself at the absurdity of the idea. But the laugh felt hollow, forced, even silly. Theo couldn't shake the tension lingering in the air. Before long, I got lost in my work, completely absorbed. Even the ticking of the pendulum clock faded into the background, becoming a sound I barely noticed anymore. It was only when I paid attention that it felt odd, as if someone was suffering, their feet moving around quickly. I remember reading somewhere that the pendulum clock was invented in 1657. Mr. Ranaouaz had mentioned that his particular clock was purchased around 1665. Though like this floated through my mind as I worked, and time passed without me realizing it. By the time I glanced at the clock again, it was past 9:13. And then it happened. Even now, when I think about it, my throat goes dry. I shut down the computer, packed my bag, and stepped out the room. As soon as I did, I froze. The pendulum had stopped, but just minutes ago. I heard it ticking. My eyes darted toward the mummy's display case. It was laying there as always, still and lifeless. Yet something felt off. That's when I noticed that clock on the wall. The hands were stuck at 6:20, but how? I had heard the pendulum ticking just moments before. My gaze shifted back to the mummy, and a chill ran down my spine. It looked as though it was laying in a slightly different position. Its posture was crooked, as if it had moved. Was my mind playing tricks on me, or was it exactly what I feared? Terrified, I bolted from the room, locking it behind me as fast as I could. I ran down the stairs, out into the garden, and straight to the gate without looking back. As I walked home, I thought about calling Mr. Ranaouaz to tell him everything. But what could I possibly say? That the mummy had gotten up and wandered around? How would anyone believe me? As I walked home, the fire in my chest began to fade. I reassured myself that everything was probably just in my head, a trick of the mind. But the pendulum clock incident kept gnawing at my throat. Trying to brush it aside, I noticed Noah, our neighborhood himself, mute, running toward me. Though his real name was Nawab, I called him Nawab, like a true Bengali. Nawab was a peculiar figure, homeless, thin, and dressed in a tattered half pant. He roamed the streets aimless. Most people in the area avoided him, annoyed by his loud midnight scream, which seemed to bring him some twisted pleasure. But I had a soft spot for him. Every day I shared a portion of my breakfast or snack with him. That day I handed him a packet of biscuits for heading home. He gleefully took it and ran off, jumping like an excited child. Watching him, I couldn't help but smile. It lightened my mood. Back at my apartment, I focused on my work, trying to ignore the unease that still lingered. It was late by the time I finished my task. The sky outside was gloomy, and a little drizzle had turned everything colder. My body ached from sleepless night, and I resolved to leave work early the next day. But fate had other plans. Sometime in the middle of my work, I dozed off. I don't remember when it happened, but in my dreams, I heard someone calling my name. A faint voice, distant yet unmistakably departed, as if coming from the depth of a well. Hey, help me! Help me! It cried. I woke up with a start, heart racing. The computer clock read 10 p.m. before. Quickly I packed it up, shut down the computer, and stepped out. The silence around me was unsettling. Just as I was looking up, I heard it again, the same voice calling for help. Time it was clear. Trembling, I followed the sound to the storage room. The voice seemed to echo all around me, but there was no one there. Suddenly, the air felt icy. My heart froze when I glanced at the glass cabin nearby. There was no reflection on my face. Instead, the glass showed a horrifying sight. A figure sprawled across the ceiling, its limbs stretched out unnaturally. Its hollow, blazing blue eyes started directly at me. I couldn't talk any longer. I ran as fast as my legs could carry me, not even bothering to lock the doors. A passing motorcyclist stopped when I urged at him frantically. Without explanation, I climbed one and he dropped me near my home. By the time I entered my room, I was drenched and trembling. That night, I couldn't sleep. The image of that monstrous figure haunted me. It wasn't just any figure, it was her, the mummy I had seen patrolling the storage building in the past. The next morning, a loud knock at my door jolt me awake. It was my landlord, urging me to step outside. He said something terrible had happened. Outside, a crowd had gathered. People murmured in hushed tone as I passed through it. See what was going on. There, laying lifeless on the road, was Ranaouaz's broken body. His frail figure was barely recognizable. Blood stained his chest, and the scene was ghastly. My heart sank. I knew what had happened, but I couldn't tell anyone who would believe me. Later that day, I received a call from my landlord at the storage building. His voice was grave. He told me that just a few days after I left, the body of Ranaouaz, my former employee, was found inside the storage room. His limbs were twisted and broken as if by some inhuman force. He pressed me for details, convinced I knew something, and so I told him everything, from the eerie noise of the horrifying reflection to Ranaouaz's death. After listening patiently, he sighed deeply. I had my suspicion, he said. He explained that Vijay had performed dark rituals, evoking a mummy to guard the storage building. That's why the place reeked of death and decay. But the ritual required a pure human's blood. Vijay had used mine to evoke the mummy without my knowledge. The mummy, bound to me because of the blood, had followed me home. It didn't harm me but instead lashed out at those it deemed my enemies. Ranaouaz, poor soul, must have been mistaken for a threat. But landlord's final words still chill me to this day. Be careful. The mummy thinks you are its master. But even masters aren't safe when their servants are monsters. I quit my job very day and moved back home. But the questions never stopped haunting me. Was the mummy still out there? And if it was, would it return for me one day? Because sometimes even your darkness nightmares aren't as scary as the shadows of your past. After finishing my conversation with Ambudkar, I left and went to bed. I didn't tell anyone in my family about this incident. I tried to sleep, but it was impossible. I kept wondering, who did that to Ranaouaz? Was it that mummy? Suddenly, a thought struck me, and I sat up straight. I remembered the drone, just like the drone. The mummy might have also drawn of me as its master because it was awakeness using my blood. And since I dislike Ranaouaz, the mummy might have killed him. I recalled that in a fit of anger, I had thought about breaking Ranaouaz's arm and leaving him helpless. On the night of Nawab's death, I had found him annoying when I saw him near the window. Could that be why the mummy killed poor Nawab on the street when it saw him? So, did all this happen because of me? Oh God! When I returned home, I felt disgusted with myself. Was the mummy planning to kill me as well? Raja might have gotten angry with himself for some reason, and that's why the drone ended up killing its own master. At the moment, another thought made my body go cold. In the afternoon, a friend of mine had called me asking for some money. I had told them I had sent it later, but they didn't listen and started provoking me instead. I got so angry that I hung up the phone after arguing with them. It wasn't just them. There were other friends there too, and they were all annoying me at the time. I was furious with all of them and even though about hitting them hard and something heavy. Glance at the clock. It was past 10 a long time ago. My hands were trembling in fear. I immediately tried calling my friends, but the phone just kept ringing and no one picked up. I believe excessive offense or attachment to anything, whether politics or religion, isn't good. Extreme obsession often indicates their very, but sometimes it can also lead to murder. And in many cases, the victim of such a murder ends up being the one who was once the master's. This story was narrated by Sanjida Mem. The story was taken from the writings of an author named Pavitra Ghosh.
Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.